Welcome everyone to our webinar, How Do You Make Good Carbon Credits? Insights from Environmental Plantings in Australia. My name is Sarah Mill, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. I acknowledge the enduring power of country and I pay respect to First Nations elders, past and present, who have nurtured and sustained country over millennia. I also wish to acknowledge that people are joining us today from all over this incredible continent that we call Australia. And you're all coming from a multitude of First Peoples, lands and nations. Sovereignty was never ceded. So on that note, I'm going to hazard a guess that what brings everybody together today is a desire to restore, regenerate and care for country, which we might also call nature, ecosystems, biodiversity and landscapes in Australia. And we all know about the challenges of climate change and land degradation. So what we're focusing on today is a key instrument or opportunity that we have for addressing some of these challenges. And to be precise, what we're focusing on is the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, which we for short call the ACCU Scheme, and one of its crucial methods, a method that's known to be high integrity, which is called environmental plantings for short. So what we're going to be sharing with you is the fruits of a 2-year research collaboration between the Australian National University and Greening Australia. And I'll just say briefly that this research was prompted by Professor Mark Howden, the former director of the Climate Institute, and he supported this research with Institute funds. So today we're going to talk through some of the research, and then we'll open up to an amazing panel of guests who have vital and practical insights to share with us and helping us to answer this question: how do you make good carbon credits? So with us today in the room and in the panel, we have Dr. Blair Parsons, who's the Director of Impact at Greening Australia, Professor Catherine Moseby, who is an ecologist and professor and landholder, many hats. She's a professor with the University of New South Wales. Mr. Keith Bradby, OAM, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Gondwana Link over in WA, and Dr. James Brazil-Boast, who's a Senior Team Leader of Restoration Science with the New South Wales Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. So you'll hear from Blair and I first. We'll talk about some of the research framing and research findings, and then we'll open up to our amazing panel. And for the last 15 minutes, we want to invite questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function to direct questions to us, and that should enable you to vote for your favourite questions as well. So don't hesitate to elevate questions to the top of the list, and you can direct them to any of the panel members. Also present are James McGregor from Greening Australia and Sam Beaver from the Australian National University, who've also been involved in this research, and they might be able to answer questions as well. So Blair, I'm going to hand over to you now, and you're going to give us some big picture policy framing, especially from a Greening Australia perspective.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. First to acknowledge that I'm coming from Wajak Noongarbuja over here in Perth, Western Australia today, sitting on the Beeliar wetlands. But if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're a national environmental NGO that is more than 40 years old, and really at the centre of what we do is biodiverse restoration. We seek to deal with the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change, and we do that through restoration, and you can see a little bit of what that looks like on the screen there. So I thought it'd be worth just having a little bit of a look. Where are the carbon projects and what do they look like? And let's put environmental plantings into context. So you can see this national map here of the ACCU scheme. Up north, we've got a lot of red projects, and those are savanna plantings. Throughout the rangelands of Australia, you can see an abundance of human-induced regeneration plantings, and there are a variety of other methods as well that you can see there. But really what we're talking about is the polygons in bright green that are scattered throughout our agricultural landscape. And that's what we're talking about is environmental plantings. So they're not necessarily the largest in terms of area, but they are quite numerous, the second most numerous projects across the country. So what sort of scale of action do we think is actually required? Well, in the last couple of weeks, the federal government released Australia's National Climate Risk Assessment, and inside the agriculture and land sector plan, they released this plot here, which broadly speaking suggests that we need in the order of 15 million hectares of restoration nationally via reforestation to contribute to net zero. That number of 15 million hectares can go up and down, but really what we're saying is we need to see an awful lot of carbon sequestration across the country. I understand you're not able to see me right now because I'm on mute, but I'm going to have to leave it like that for now, but we will proceed. Next slide, please. So when Greening Australia thinks about carbon sequestration, it's important to note that we, as well as seeking to achieve emissions reduction, we're using carbon sequestration and that functional market as a means of achieving some of our other core objectives around environment and community. We want to seek additional benefits beyond carbon sequestration. And so you can see on the screen there a list of impact themes, and those are the sorts of things that Greening Australia considers really important. So things like ecosystem condition or quality, genuine biodiversity benefit, and threatened taxa status change. And in the community space, we want to see mutually beneficial and trusted partnerships and that sort of thing. So when we are looking at these sorts of things and assessing against those different impact themes, there are different ways that you could undertake an environmental planting. On the screen here, the wheel is an adaptation of an assessment wheel used by the Society of Ecological Restoration. But in short, I could describe that depending on how filled in the green portion of the wheel is how strong a project might be environmentally. Blue portion, how strong it is for community, and brown, how strong it is for economy. If we look at a conceptual carbon environmental planting that is a minimum viable product, i.e. low diversity, trying to maximise cost effectiveness and that sort of thing, it's not really very well rounded and not contributing to some of those other impact themes I mentioned. And that's apparent with the example that I'm showing on the screen there. Next slide, please. However, there is the potential with environmental plantings to quite specifically go after some of those multiple benefits as well. So we might quite specifically look to enhance connectivity and condition, and that's where we need to bring in a whole lot more diversity and structural considerations in the plantings that we undertake. That might be where we seek to genuinely engage in lasting and mutually beneficial partnerships and the like, and focus on a bit more of a well-rounded economic outcome, both for landholders and for ecosystem services and so forth. So that's just contrasting some of the examples of what an environmental planting might look like and what the difference might be between business as usual and good or better practice environmental plantings. Next slide, and that might be me, Sarah.
Thank you so much. That's a really great segue into the research question that we had in this research project. It's a pretty loaded question. I acknowledge that. How do you make good carbon credits? We could have also asked, can you make good carbon credits? But let's stick with the how. So in posing this question, what we've done is acknowledge that not all carbon credits are made equal. And Blair's explained that there is such thing as good or desirable carbon, and there's such thing as bad carbon too. And as Blair has said, good carbon can produce fantastic additional benefits for production, for biodiversity, for community and individual well-being, for First Nations sovereignty, for regional economies. And then bad carbon, by definition, will probably do the opposite of those things and indeed may generate new risks or undesirable effects. This was our starting point for the research, and to delve into it, we did some empirical work on two widespread methods in Australia, one being human-induced regeneration and then the other being environmental plantings. So obviously the talk today is about environmental plantings. And what we aimed to do was to understand the real-life impacts of carbon farming. And to do that, we set out to study the costs, the benefits, the effects, the risks, the consequences, both intended and unintended, of a range of environmental planting schemes. And the method really is in qualitative social science. This is about listening to people who are directly involved in these projects, and that includes practitioners, landholders, and custodians. So with that being our research aim, we also mobilised some key concepts. And I wanted to mention some of these because there's been a lot of international literature, for example, coming out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the World Bank, the IPCC processes that tell us about multi-benefit approaches to climate change mitigation, or nature-based solutions. These are approaches that try to work with the land sector and try to regenerate, sequestering carbon, but also delivering other benefits as well. So the concepts are out there. And then a related concept we've seen emerging from the Australian context from the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation as well, where they talk about core benefits. So the idea is that you focus upon your core business of healthy people, healthy country, and then from there you use environmental markets as you see fit. In a core benefits idea, the carbon is the side benefit or the means to the end. So the concept that we worked with quite a bit was co-impacts, which is a bit more nuanced than the commonly heard term co-benefits. So some examples of co-impacts are listed here in the table. Sorry to show a table for you. But the point about co-impacts is that co-impacts can be both good and bad, or positive and negative. And we approached the work thinking about co-impacts in three different domains: the environmental domain, the social domain, and the economic domain. So we've got an emerging literature now in Australia that's telling us empirically about the kinds of impacts that are emerging from ACCU projects. And obviously co-impacts can include, for the environmental space, biodiversity, habitat, soil health, erosion control. In the social domain, we might see community development, regional development, First Nations custodianship, but there might also be some negatives, for example, absentee landholders. And then there's a similar set of questions around economic co-impacts, costs and benefits. The thing I wanted to say about co-impacts is that they are multi-scalar, so they happen at different levels: local, regional, national and global. And they're uneven. So some impacts might be felt intensely on the ground, but have no consequence at a global scale, or vice versa. And they're uneven in the sense that some people might be winning and others might be losing. For some people, a positive impact might be wealth generation on a carbon project, whereas that might bring certain costs for neighbours or community. So we built a heuristic in one of our early publications, which I'm showing here. I'm not expecting anybody to get their head around this diagram, but it does try to capture how hard it is to measure impact. It's a hard thing to pin down across these different dimensions, except that it's very important in the research for understanding what good practice carbon farming might be. Because all of this implies that good carbon farming entails an effort to maximise what's good and a parallel equal effort to minimise what's bad. So let's just talk about the data and then I'll explain some of the findings. As I said, we partnered with Greening Australia on this research, and that really was a partnership around conceptualisation upfront and then gaining access to project sites, practitioners and landholders. But Greening Australia was not present in the data collection process because we tried very hard to make sure that the research and the data were independent, and we got an ethics clearance along those lines. So we ended up conducting research in 3 prominent sites where environmental plantings have been underway, as shown on this map: Southwest WA, the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia, and then around Canberra, the Monaro and Southern Highlands region. So Greening Australia has been active in these 3 areas, and we interviewed 33 different participants, a mixture of landholders and practitioners across a mix of different projects, some of which were for ACCU production, for carbon, and others which were not for carbon. And I guess it's an opportunity to compare and to observe how different planting designs and strategies fare over time. And then, of course, in this data collection process, we were asking questions about how the projects were planned and implemented. We were asking about what co-impacts had been observed by landholders and project proponents in particular. And then we were distilling all of that information to then draw some conclusions around what's good practice carbon farming. So I'll just finish with 3 observations, 3 things to do with our findings. The first relates to what it is that motivates landholders to engage in environmental planting and the kinds of priorities that they brought to project design. And then secondly, I'll cover off on some of the co-impacts that were observed and summarise those. And then thirdly, I'll explain what we think this might mean for policy and practice. Okay, so firstly, on landholder motivations, there's an overwhelming finding here that landholders are motivated by a desire to enhance biodiversity and restore ecosystems. For biodiversity, this was over 81% of respondents. And then a parallel finding is that carbon sequestration was not the core motivation or design priority for most of the projects. And really carbon came into the design chiefly for being compliant with the ACCU method, but not for any other particular purpose. People were not seeking to produce carbon monocrops. Another important finding is that the landholders in these projects were not expecting to make big money out of the ACCU scheme or out of carbon credits. They weren't chasing profit. They were engaging in the environmental plantings projects for a range of other reasons and values. And usually the returns were enough to cover the costs of implementing the planting over time. Breaking even was probably okay given the other benefits or co-benefits. So here, the final point is that the production co-benefits of environmental plantings were a vital driver, especially among the farmers who had undertaken environmental plantings. So some of these production co-benefits emerged from environmental plantings serving as shelter belts, providing fodder and nutrition for animals, especially during tough times, and for general landscape resilience, especially in a changing climate. Okay, so now I'll just cover off on some of the co-impacts that we observed, and I'll do that in 2 batches. I'll start with the co-benefits, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the risks or costs. So this is just an indication here of the types of co-benefits that people mentioned in the interviews, and I've noted the frequency that they were mentioned at, and I'm sort of listing the top types of co-impacts and co-benefits that people observed. And overwhelmingly here, the top 2 co-benefits relate to biodiversity enhancement and ecosystem resilience. But there are other co-benefits too in the social and economic domains. It was interesting that cultural change and the ability to inspire or influence neighbours around environmental plantings was seen as a benefit. And sort of other values of having bush around, aesthetic values, education values, and values around well-being. In terms of the economics, a standout was not just production benefits, but also employment for land managers. And that was employment in managing the environmental plantings over time. Okay, so in terms of risks or negative co-impacts, again, the standout co-impacts here related to the environment, and these were pest fauna. That's one way of putting it. I've put some These are meant to be deer, feral deer, lining up in the table. Deer came up, kangaroos came up, and then fire risk as well. So these are direct land management questions. Or they have implications for land management, is what I want to say. And there were other perceived negative co-impacts too. Again, these are uneven. They weren't super high frequency, but in some places there were concerns around community cohesion or stress or disappointment if an environmental planting should fail, or other sort of on-farm concerns about opportunity costs or loss of flexibility with land use. Okay, so finally, reflecting upon people's motivations and the co-impacts that we observed, I'll just make a final few comments on what we think this might mean for good practice carbon farming. I mean, I think it tells us that you can do good practice carbon farming, but a lot falls to the landholder and the implementer in terms of realising this good quality carbon. So it's very apparent that targeting the co-benefits upfront in project design is important, and that especially goes for biodiversity, but also goes for meeting local needs and socialising the idea of the environmental planting. So if you don't have local acceptance or local buy-in, then the project's going to be hard. Obviously, mitigating risks over the long term is another aspect to a good carbon project. This involves managing pests, fire, grazing pressure, and that can be costly. As I said, this question of social license and community consultation emerges as being very important in good practice carbon farming. If there is not a wide acceptance locally that environmental plantings are an appropriate land use, then this can be a challenge for the project. And finally, a lot of this work around juggling the costs and the benefits and juggling the design questions falls to industry partners and then community networks who need to build trust. They need to find ways to share risks and to invest in local capacity and co-design. But my final point is that all of this good practice can be hindered by policy shortcomings, and this is something we'll probably get to in the discussion. There was quite a lot of frustration about policy settings that just didn't incentivize or accelerate the good practice that people knew was possible and really wanted to implement. So I've listed a few of these policy shortcomings here. These include constraints around seed supply, problems with various kinds of red and green tape, often at the local level, or local council level, and which can be highly variable between jurisdictions, and that can waste time and sort of drain resources and morale. There's also a clear trade-off between biodiversity outcomes and carbon outcomes, which is what Blair mentioned, that under the ACCU scheme, obviously what counts as carbon is going to be 20% cover at 2 metres high, and that is not what biodiversity looks like all of the time, especially in some of these landscapes like the Eyre Peninsula, which was quite arid. And then finally, there's a lot of complexity in the ACCU scheme, which makes it hard for people to navigate the space. And so that points to the need for collective action and aggregation, which I think Greening Australia people can speak to. I'm going to wrap up there and stop sharing my slides and now invite comment from panel members, because I feel like I've spoken enough. So I gave brief introductions to the panel members at the start, and I'm now going to throw the ball around to different panel members and get them to do a more detailed introduction of themselves. And I'm going to ask them targeted questions. So I'm going to start with Keith Bradby. Keith, could you please introduce yourself and tell us about your experience with environmental plantings and restoration? And in particular, it would be fantastic if you could reflect upon what it takes to mobilise communities and landholders across the whole landscape to achieve the outcomes that you want. And also, it would be great if you could speak to some of your work on building First Nations ownership models and custodianship models in that context. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, and look, thanks for all that. There's nothing in that I can disagree with, which is a big disappointment. I guess it's really about the how. My background, you go back a long time, and I was working as a commercial seed picker for the regeneration industry, and I was around when we started playing with bizarre notions like direct seeding and so on. For the last 20-something years, we've been part of the Conceptual program with Greening Australia and other key partners, trying to achieve a scaling up of all the land care plantings and up to the level where it can make a big ecological difference. We, I guess, started the program with philanthropic backing, and this is before the invention of ACCUs. And we're now, a lot of good work has happened there. And I think we've had many of the similar issues you've just raised and things we've had to work through. I think the biggest few for me have been trying to build the financial side beyond the stage where you're doing it property by property, year by year, you know, ringing up seed pickers, nurseries in December and saying we're going to do a big planting next year doesn't work well. You've really got to be able to plan 5 years ahead or more, and I think we're all having trouble getting to that, and getting good ecological standards into the plantings has been a challenge, and a bit of a trade-off between the convenience of well, I've got a bag of seed, but it's from 40 kilometres away, and in southwestern Australia that doesn't actually work. You know, we've got high localised endemism, and then there's the questions of getting the right structure so the wildlife comes back, and I think we've done really well on that. Probably the last getting up to 10 years now, carbon, a bit longer actually, carbon's been increasing as a driver, both with the NGO groups we work with. Not so much a driver as an enabler, I guess is a better phrase, carbon enable. And there's been a bit of a tussle to make sure that the work we do, the overall goals we've had since inception are carbon enabled and not carbon captured. You know, some of the times we're in heathland situations where you can't grow as much carbon as you can if you go to tree plantations and all those sort of issues. The more recent work, we've been somewhat instrumental in drawing together key partnerships with some of the carbon entities and the First Nations families and entities here, and setting up some quite lovely business models, working with groups like Carbon Neutral, Tiverton Ag Fund. And at essence, what we're trying to do is get multiple benefits from the land, secure the land, start a re-veg program in such a way that not only benefits the local communities through employment, but the First Nations groups, and see that land eventually handed back to First Nations groups for a multiple of uses, including the ongoing carbon. And look, that's involved lots of financial and legal gymnastics, but the base of it is trust between the players, goodwill to achieve the multiple benefits, and the fact that land and carbon and the other benefits can be separate legal entities in many ways. So you can effectively hold a mortgage on the carbon as distinct from the rights on the land. Quite complex stuff. Yeah, and I think, look, last key point, there's no cookie cutter. I mean, the various families and First Nation corporations we've worked with, just about everyone has a slightly different model, particularly given the investors are different too. that's a quick overview. I can do it for the next 24 hours if you like. It's been a long journey.
Thank you so much, Keith. And I really appreciate your last point that there are no cookie cutters in this space. Okay, Catherine, I'm going to hand over to you now. You're in a really unique situation as a landholder and a restoration ecologist. Please introduce yourself. Tell us about your work. Tell us about your experience with plantings, and indeed how you've navigated the complexity of the ACCU scheme.
So I'm a conservation biologist living on the Eyre Peninsula in regional South Australia. Most of my work's been on sort of arid zone rewilding and reintroducing threatened species, so I didn't really have any experience with revegetation. But my partner and I, we own 3 carbon properties, all on the west coast of the Eyre Peninsula that we bought personally. The first one's 8 years old. It's only about 100 hectares, and we re-vegged it in collaboration with Greening Australia, but not for the sale of the carbon. That was just our own carbon offset. We had some initial trials, and the kangaroos ate all our re-veg, so we spent about $60,000 fencing the 100 hectares and removing the kangaroos, and then Greening Australia re-vegged it for us. And that one's looking fantastic. It's 8 years in, and it's looking really good. The second one was a group project through Greening Australia. So this one was for sale of carbon, and it's about 180 hectares, again on freehold land. It was an old sheep wheat paddock. And Greening Australia got a few neighbours together to do that one. That's 3 years in and a bit patchy, but going okay. There was sort of recent sheep and wheat in that paddock, so whether that's affected it or not. The third one is the biggest project yet, so it's leasehold land on Talia Station. This is a pastoral lease. It's around 900 hectares that we're going to be planting. This one's been a lot harder because of the leasehold land, so there's a lot of sort of special consent that we need from different organisations and different eligible interest holders and things. And that one used to be sheoak grassy woodlands, which is a threatened ecological community. So I guess from a landholder perspective, some of the good points we've found, we're really proud and happy to be doing something positive, and that's what we want. We want to make a difference, and we feel that that is actually happening, which is great. We're really happy with that. The carbon credits paid for the re-veg, which was our main motivation. We couldn't afford to do all that re-veg on our own, buy the seed and put it all in. So that's sort of been great. We were motivated equally by habitat restoration and carbon. So it was really important to us to include threatened sheoak grassy woodland species. That's the one that's got 3% remnancy. And there was really strong support from Greening Australia with that. So it was really good to work with them because they were also keen to get the biodiversity benefit. For the first 2 projects, working with Greening Australia meant we didn't have to deal with all the admin and the ACCU scheme things, which was really complicated because there's lots of permissions and approvals and audits. And it also meant we could team up with neighbours as Greening Australia coordinated all that. So that was fantastic. And they also did all the re-veg and the root control and weed control for the first couple of years, so we could be hands off. We both worked full time, and they had a lot of experienced staff with good local knowledge. So it was really reassuring to be able to ask some questions and get that really expert advice. So that was really helpful to have Greening Australia guide us through that process. I guess in terms of the difficulties, we learnt that the re-veg really does need that long-term rue and weed control, and sometimes that's not factored in at the start and really needs to be going in the long term, and that was something that became very evident early on. The complicated process of the landholder permissions. For the pastoral land now, we need a lot of native title approval, and we need pastoral board approval, and we also still need council approval. And there's sort of no agreed sort of timeline of sort of getting an answer back and things, and that's really delayed our planting. We didn't get to plant this year, and even next year now looks at risk. So that's kind of been a frustration with not having clear timelines of when you can expect answers. The plants grow really slowly. You have to be patient, which is really difficult, or we find that really difficult. And yeah, maybe having some sort of clear timeline or flow chart that you can send to landholders to sort of track the process would be really good. So yeah, overall, we're really happy to be involved in all the carbon, but the focus for us is really a dual focus of the carbon and the biodiversity credit, biodiversity outcomes, and that to 20% cover at 2-metre height. I mean, we could just plant eucalypts and acacias and get those carbon credits, but that wouldn't give us much biodiversity benefit. So some of the old re-veg sites on the Eyre Peninsula, they're still 15 years down the track in rows with no sort of native grasses and understory and structural complexity between them. So I think we really need to start thinking more about how we can integrate those two things better. Even soil health is not really considered. It'd be really interesting to know how recent cropping or grazing affects the success of the plantings and do some research on that. Also, how best to measure those biodiversity benefits from carbon planting. It's not really an easy thing to measure. And finally, I guess fire. Fire is considered bad for carbon credits, but in Mallee, where we're from, most of the carbon is sort of stored in the lignotuber, but this doesn't really seem to get recognised in carbon calculations. And also maybe we need fire to get that revegetation happening between the lines. It'd be good to do some sort of trials like that. So yeah, that's just some thoughts for us. But if there's any landholders listening, I'd really encourage you to get into it. It's really satisfying going out there, and when eventually they do grow, 8 years in, we've got 2-metre high plants already in some places. So yeah, it's really rewarding, and I thoroughly recommend it.
Oh, that's so inspiring, Catherine. We could have you talking for 24 hours as well. So glad you mentioned soil and fire. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to James Brazil-Boast, and then hopefully we can have more time for questions at the end. James, you've got a unique perspective in New South Wales government here and conducting research about the role of ACCU and restoration. Over to you. Introduce yourself too.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and thanks for the invite. So last year, the New South Wales government published a plan for nature, which is a response to the review of our environmental legislation, the Biodiversity Conservation Act. And in that, there's a commitment to develop a nature strategy, which will have really promote ecosystem restoration and have targets for restoration in New South Wales. And so we have this challenge to those targets have yet to be set and the strategy yet to be written, but ultimately we do want to have an uplift in restoration in New South Wales. I didn't introduce myself, sorry again. So I'm within the restoration science team within New South Wales ACCU, Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And so our role is really to do research that enhances outcomes of restoration and improves the evidence base and can help government make good decisions about investment in restoration and help non-government players in this space to get good outcomes from restoration. And I guess when I say good, that really aligns with what you were talking about earlier. And so basically your whole presentation, Sarah, this whole project really epitomizes the challenge we have. We're going to want to ideally improve the extent and condition of ecosystems in New South Wales over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years. There's likely to be a gap between what government investment can achieve. And so big part of that gap with private investment is at the moment, the majority of that is coming from carbon. So we have this key question is, how do we really maximize all of those co-benefits that you spoke about, in particular the biodiversity ones, to help us meet those biodiversity targets? There's this condition and extent targets. And so in the short term, we're really interested from the ACCU scheme in understanding what are the constraints to getting those good outcomes. And for the example of biodiversity, as already been pointed out today, there's a spectrum there of an environmental planting project, from just being eligible for the scheme with a focus on maximizing yield and minimizing cost, right up to, I guess, what we would consider a benchmark or reference state ecosystem outcome. And so my team is really interested in understanding, well, what are the different places along that spectrum, and what are the constraints on achieving that? Particularly, what are the financial constraints? What are the policy constraints? And once we understand that, I guess we can then help inform decision makers about, okay, well, where can New South Wales government best invest to nudge the most proponents and the most hectares along that spectrum to better biodiversity outcomes? And so, yeah, building on the kind of work that you've done here. And so, yeah, I guess that's our our interest in this space, and sort of building that, we see as building that model and really understanding in detail what the relationship between the costs and the benefits in this space are, is the first step to us being able to then influence those things. And that might be things, not just direct investment by government, but also things that will indirectly improve that cost benefit scenario. You mentioned seed availability, you mentioned the costs and time associated with regulation. And so if government can invest smartly to, say, increase the availability and reduce the cost of diverse seed, if they can reduce those regulatory barriers to restoration, all those things should make it cheaper to get better biodiversity and social and economic outcomes from ACCU projects. So we're kind of at the start of that journey, I think. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, James. It's really lovely to hear about research that will inform policy, and to see how state and territory governments can also interact with the federal policy to cover gaps and get what we want. Blair, I'm just going to hand to you before we open up for Q&A. If you wanted to make a final summary comment or two about the big opportunities and the constraints that you're seeing in relation to environmental plantings methods. And there's also a question that's come through on seed, but yeah, final word, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
No worries, and I might link to that question if I can. But in terms of the biggest opportunities from good carbon or environmental projects, obviously, I think it is around reversing biodiversity loss, the provision of habitat, and healing land degradation. And so I'd like to point out that it is happening, so Greening Australia, but not only us, many other providers, many other individual landholders around the country are doing that. So that's exciting to see. But we want to see more of it, and we want to see it more explicitly directed towards those multiple benefits, I think, to really realise that opportunity. In the conduct of environmental plantings, what it's actually doing as well is fostering and facilitating a restoration economy. So if I take Western Australia over here as an example, we've seen the formation over the last handful of years of a substantial First Nations tree nursery, Bulla Burnap, and it's an excellent example of a successful business, and one that now forms a really important partner for us and others to be able to deliver these things. And we're also seeing greater organisation, resilience and progress within First Nations ranger teams and corporations as they seek to deliver and sometimes lead some of this work. And then finally, in terms of a high level opportunity, I think this whole thing, the whole carbon market with environmental plantings, is allowing us to lead the way into a genuine nature repair market. So we must remember that ultimately this is sort of built on the premise of offsets. So there are some emissions we have to deal with. And that's okay, because we need to avoid, mitigate and offset everything at the moment. We need to do everything we can around emissions, but what it's also doing is providing us with an awful lot of learnings about how to get to nature positive and net gain in terms of biodiversity. Really quickly around the constraints, often one of the biggest constraints is actually a misalignment in vision and goals. So it's interesting here that we are talking about the fact that Greening Australia would like to use that carbon market for biodiversity outcomes, not for carbon. We're often dealing with people and funders who would like to use that market for carbon. And so we've got to figure out where we meet in the middle there and where our values align. And then also, crucially, we need to bring those values together with the landholder and any other relevant stakeholders. There are some constraints around ambiguity in the regulation, and I won't go into that in too much detail, but yeah, the way the regulation and the legislation is written at the moment, biodiversity is just not locked in sufficiently, and I think there's a lot more scope for that. And the question here is posed around a constraint to good practice, but I think there's actually constraint to good outcomes. So although people might be able to take a best practice approach and do what they can, often we might struggle to locate appropriate land, or it's not clear where we would do the work for best bang for buck. And like we've already talked about with seed, there's constraint there, and sometimes that's because carbon projects have a certain time schedule, and that doesn't necessarily fit with nature or the emerging seed sector. You know, it's not an enormous and well-developed market and sector at the moment. So, you know, the more these markets mature, the more the supply chains that fit in underneath can mature as well. And finally, we just need to be better at validating all these benefits we're talking about. So sometimes we feel a little bit like missionaries as we say, it's great, you know, trust us, all these things happen, but we actually need better monitoring, evaluation, better data, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blair. On the question of seed, I'm just wondering whether, Catherine, whether you wanted to comment briefly on your seed experiences or views.
Yeah, so I mean, Blair probably be best for Green Australia, but definitely there's local, not much wild sites left to harvest from, at least for she-oak grassy woodlands, because it's been cleared so much. So over 97%, might even be higher now, 98% has been cleared. So there just isn't enough seed to physically collect and physically use when you're trying to get those biodiverse plantings. If you just wanted monocultures of eucalypts, you'd be fine. But I think that's, you know, and then physically getting people to get out there and collect the seed, and often it's all available at the same time. So you've got to try and harvest it in a short window, and just trying to get people out into those remote areas to harvest it and find it. It's quite difficult.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Okay, I'm going to dive into the Q&A here. We've got quite a bit. Michelle Smith has asked a question about phasing out fossil fuels and regenerating the biosphere. Isn't the idea of offsets inappropriate? I think Blair answered that question in his wrap-up comments, that we just need to do everything we possibly can. I don't know whether you wanted to comment again on that, Blair. But
Keith's making some noises. Go for it, Keith.
Oh, well, yeah, we can't, as much as some of us would like to, we're not going to shut down Western society overnight. But I think it's really important to think about it as part of an environmental planting, who you're selling to. If it's a fossil fuel company that's trying to expand, well, I'd suggest we give them the flick. If it's a genuine manufacturing or transport company that is on a solid pathway to a solid transition to carbon neutral in their operations or absolutely minimised, they're the guys we want to help along that journey. And I'd also add that with a number we've worked with, they might come in on a carbon, and we've got to keep our business afloat. How do we reduce our carbon and so on? But take them out on country with some wonderful Noongar folk and show them all the stuff that's happening, the woodwork and the malleefowl that are coming back. And you also make an additional influence on the corporate culture of those companies. You've got to play with these guys, but just be cautious and have some principles on who you do play with.
I think that's really great advice, Keith, and it relates to the question here from Andrew Cherry, who's asking, is it common to do the work, get the carbon credit, and then not sell it, or to have some discretion about who you sell it to, not sell it on to an emitter as an offset? And Blair might also have views on that. But
yep, so the question from Andrew about, is it common to do the work, get the credit, and not on sell?
Yeah,
I'd actually love to hear from James McGregor. James really leads our carbon efforts within Greening Australia, and is at the coalface of some of those commercial realities and how things are structured. So I'm wondering, James, whether you're available to speak on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. I can touch on that one. I'll briefly introduce myself as well. So James McGregor, I'm the Executive Director of Carbon and Origination at Greening Australia and our carbon compliance subsidiary Canopy. It's a really interesting question in that that's changed a little bit over time. So particularly in the model that we're talking about with these projects, we're delivering projects on private land with other landholders, and as part of that, we typically have a share arrangement where the carbon credits or the revenue from carbon credits are shared between us and the landholder. And we've certainly noticed a trend over time where particularly farming-based landholders have been inclined towards wanting to retain their share of carbon credits and not seek to capitalise on selling those into the market with a view for their potential need for future carbon border adjustment mechanisms or their own carbon neutrality strategies or whatever it might be. And so in those cases, we're sharing the credits to them, and I'm very much sure that they're not immediately going out into the market with them. The other side of the carbon credits really depends a little bit on how the initial funding of the project work is structured. So a lot of our initial funding, as Catherine talked about there, where the revegetation work comes at no cost to the landholder, typically our funders to do this work are looking for the carbon credits to return back to them as part of their carbon neutrality strategies. And so they're not necessarily being sold to an emitter, but it's provided back to them as part of their investment in the project. Through other investments, we have funded projects that we do take to market, and those do go off to emitters, various sources of their emissions. We also sell to brokers as well, and we don't have a lot of insight into where those ultimately end up. So broadly, I'd say that there is a trend for some credits to be retained, particularly by landholders, but ultimately the majority of the credits are probably still ending up being used as offsets from the emission sources.
Thank you, James. I think that's really helpful. We're running out of time. There are two more questions. One I'm going to direct to Sam Beaver, who did a lot of the fieldwork and interviews. And these are questions, there's a couple of them that have come in about how we sampled the landholders and the practitioners, and whether we spoke to anyone who had initially engaged but then walked out on a ACCU project. Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I suppose one of the main ways to answer this question is to break down a little bit of who our participants were. So we talked to practitioners, we talked to landholders with carbon projects, and we also talked to landholders who had kind of undergone revegetation works that wasn't directly linked to carbon or the ACCU scheme. And in the answer to that question, did we only speak to people who completed projects? No, there was like a variety of project timelines being implemented of people that we talked to. I think one of the most interesting things that came from talking to folks who had non-carbon projects, so they were still engaging in restoration work, they were planting trees in the same way that you would for carbon, was that the carbon system and the carbon market was often inaccessible to those people. So quite a lot of them would have liked to have engaged in carbon projects. But for whatever reason, and there were a number of common reasons, such as, the carbon market being really administratively burdensome, their projects were too small, so it didn't kind of stack up on the economies of scale. All those sorts of things kind of push them into doing their own revegetation work outside of the carbon market. And so I'm not sure if that's specifically around answers around who might have completely abandoned revegetation as kind of a principle, but certainly folks abandoned trying to do an ACCU project because it is really hard and administratively difficult. And that is why organisations like Greening Australia, as well as many others, exist to try and make that admin a little bit easier, because they've spent many years wrapping their heads around it.
Thank you so much, Sam. We have time for one final question, and I'm going to direct it to Catherine, because there's been a batch coming in about landholder perspectives and how do we engage landholders who haven't yet participated or shown interest. Over to you, Catherine.
I just wanted to share one anecdote. We have a neighbour on the Eyre Peninsula, one of our properties, who owns a lot of land, and talked to him about potentially putting one paddock or something under carbon alongside our carbon initiative. And his grandfather or great-grandfather cleared the land there, and I think his perception was that, you know, that scrub is useless land and that we put all this effort into clearing the land to make it productive, and so, you know, putting it back into scrub is just a waste of time. Even when I sort of pointed out that you can co-graze under carbon farming. Once the trees have got to a certain height, you could graze your sheep underneath them and you get carbon and grazing. Still very sort of suspicious that the money would ever come, that there was a big risk that you might not even get the funding, you know, in the future, that the carbon thing might all fall apart. And then even when I pointed out that there's voluntary carbon markets where you actually get paid upfront for your carbon, which we were looking at as well, that not the ACCU scheme, but an international voluntary carbon scheme, he still was just very dismissive of the whole thing. So I think there's a lot of suspicion and a lot of kind of just resistance, not really necessarily based on any logic either. So I think, you know, making it upfront payments or even stressing the co-grazing, but I think, you know, gradually, hopefully that will become more common and as neighbours do it and people see it, but there's still a lot of resistance out there, I think, from regular farmers.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I think that to some extent answers that final question about what are the policies and methods to increase landholder uptake. It's on 4 o'clock, so I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists, James, Catherine, Keith, Blair, another James, Sam, and to the audience. Thank you for being with us and thank you for your questions. I'm sure that all of the panelists would be happy to respond to further questions via email. Okay, on that note, have a wonderful day. Thank you.